Dawn breaks slow over 18 acres of pale, dying Maine soil. Wind moves across the field. A stone wall built 100 years ago runs along the eastern edge, and behind it, a farmhouse with a sagging porch waits in the gray light. The kitchen window glows. Inside, a woman in a barn coat stands at the sink, silver hair pinned back, hands lined from 4 decades of small labors. She sets down a coffee cup. Her husband's coffee cup, still on the second shelf where he left it the morning he died. Her eyes turn toward the road. Down at the top of the drive, a dark car idles. A tall man in a wool overcoat steps out. Beside him, a broad-shouldered man who will not meet her gaze. They carry a leather portfolio and an offer written in 7 figures. She walks to the door. She has already decided. The tide came in slow that morning, along the eastern edge of Maine, sliding across gray sand and cracked shell the way it had for 10,000 years, before anyone thought to name the coast or measure the acres beside it. 18 of those acres sat above the tide line, held in place by a stone wall Thomas Whitfield's grandfather had built by hand in 1919, and by a farmhouse whose porch had begun to sag 2 winters back. The barn behind the house was missing half its roof. The fields from a distance still looked like fields. Up close, they told a different story, one written in pale patches and thin stalks and dust that lifted at the smallest breath of wind. Eleanor Whitfield stood at the edge of the north field just after dawn, with her hands buried in the pockets of a worn barn coat that had once belonged to her husband. Her hair silver where it used to be soft brown was pinned back the way she had worn it every morning of her married life. She was 68 years old. Her hands, when she pulled them free of the pockets, were lined and slightly swollen at the knuckles from 4 decades of small labors, and they knew this land the way most women knew the corners of their own kitchens. 3 weeks earlier, she had buried Thomas beneath a granite marker 2 miles down the road in the cemetery where his father and grandfather were already waiting. He had gone on a Tuesday morning in March quietly at the kitchen table with a coffee cup still warm beside his hand. The doctor called it a heart attack. Eleanor called it the end of 41 years, which was another way of saying the same thing. She knelt down at the edge of the field, the joints in her knees protesting the way they always did in cold weather, and pressed her palm against the ground. The soil there was pale and compacted, almost chalky in places, and when she lifted a handful and let it sift through her fingers, it fell in a fine dry stream that caught the morning light and drifted away like ash on the breeze. She watched it go. Her throat tightened. The words came before she could stop them, spoken softly to no one but the wind. "This ground died before you did, Thomas, and I don't know how to bring either of you back." She stayed there a long time on her knees in the March cold until the sun climbed high enough to cast her shadow across the pale earth. Then she stood up, slowly brushed the dust from her palms, and walked back toward the house. The kitchen inside the farmhouse was quiet the way only the kitchens of the recently widowed are quiet, with 2 chairs pushed under a table set for one. A wood stove ticked as it cooled from the previous evening's fire. On the wall beside the pantry hung a wooden sign Thomas had carved for their 10th anniversary, and it still read in his careful hand, "Brookside Farm, 1978. He had named the place for the small creek that ran along the western edge of the property, though the creek was thinner now than it used to be, and slower the way most things on the farm had grown thinner and slower over the last several years. Eleanor made herself a cup of coffee she did not particularly want. She sat down at the table. On the countertop, unopened, waited 3 envelopes she had been avoiding for 6 days. 2 were sympathy cards from women at the church. The third was a letter from the bank, which she recognized by the return address before she had even touched it. She reached for it now because reaching for it later would be no easier, and she was too tired for the kind of dread that only grew heavier the longer it sat. The letter was polite. The letter was firm. 2 months of the mortgage remained unpaid at the time of Thomas's passing. A third was now approaching. The bank understood her circumstances and offered its condolences. It also expected payment. She folded the letter in half and set it beneath the salt shaker. She drank the coffee she did not want. She looked out the window at the 18 acres that had been hers now for exactly 22 days. The knock at the door came a little past 10. She was not surprised by it. There had been a knock at the door nearly every day since the funeral, sometimes casseroles, sometimes flowers, more often. Lately, a question dressed up as concern. Silas Thornton stood on the porch this time, hat in his hands, his old brown coat buttoned all the way to the throat. He was 72, thin as a wire, and had farmed the parcel adjoining hers for as long as she and Thomas had been married. Eleanor, he began, and she could hear the whole speech behind it before he said another word. I don't want to be the one to bring this up, but you've got to think about what comes next. This land needs more than one pair of hands, especially hands that are as tired as ours are. There's no shame in letting it go to somebody who can still work it. She held the door open with the flat of her palm. She thanked him for coming. She did not invite him in. He tried again more gently. There's a fair market for parcels this size. You wouldn't have to worry about the winter. You could move into town, be close to the church, close to people who care about you. The people who care about me are already in this house or under the ground, she answered, and her voice was quieter than the words themselves. And Silas Thornton flinched a little because he had known Thomas since they were boys and understood exactly what she meant. He put his hat back on. He walked down the porch steps. He did not press her further. By the end of that first week, 2 more neighbors had come and gone with variations of the same message. The soil is done, Eleanor. The Whitfield land has been thin for years. Everybody knows it. No shame in admitting it. Take the money. Move into town. She listened to each of them the way she had been raised to listen, with her hands folded and her eyes soft, and she thanked each of them for their concern. And then she walked the fields alone in the early morning, the way she and Thomas had walked them together for 4 decades, and every step confirmed what her palm had already told her that first day at the north edge. The ground was tired, but something in her, something that had gone quiet since March, was not yet ready to agree that tired meant finished. The man who came on the 7th day was different. He drove a dark sedan that did not belong on the rutted farm road, and he wore a wool coat that had never seen a barn. He stood on the porch with a leather folder tucked under one arm and introduced himself as Harlan Pruitt, representing certain private interests who were assembling holdings in the region. He said the words private interests the way another man might have said good afternoon smoothly, as though they meant nothing. He offered her a number. The number was fair, not generous. Fair. Enough to clear the mortgage, enough to move into a small place in town, enough to live modestly for the rest of a modest life. He said all of this with the calm certainty of a man who had delivered such numbers many times before and had rarely heard a refusal that lasted. Eleanor listened. She did not sit down. She did not offer him coffee. When he had finished, she asked him a single question. Who exactly are these private interests, Mr. Pruitt? His smile did not change. His eyes did. Investors, he told her. Land is a long game, ma'am. There's no need to trouble yourself with the particulars. She thanked him for his visit. She told him she would think on it. She closed the door. Then she went to the small table by the entryway where he had set his business card, and she picked it up and she turned it over. On the back in fine print she had almost missed ran a line she read 3 times before it settled: Consultant Land Acquisition, Division Coastal Grain Holdings. She knew that name. Every farmer between Portland and Bar Harbor knew that name. Coastal Grain was the largest agricultural corporation in the state, and it did not send consultants to buy tired soil unless the tired soil was for reasons Eleanor could not yet imagine worth buying. She stood in the entryway holding the small piece of card in her fingers and felt for the first time since Thomas's funeral something that was not grief. It was not hope either. It was closer to the sharp attention a woman feels when she hears a footstep in a house she believed was empty. Something did not add up. and she had lived long enough to know that when something did not add up, somebody else was doing the arithmetic in a room she had not yet been invited into. Sleep did not come easily that night. It had not come easily any night since March. She lay in the bed she and Thomas had shared for 41 years, on her half because the other half had become a place she could not yet bring herself to occupy, and she listened to the house make the small, settling noises it had always made in the dark. Around 2 in the morning, she gave up. She got up. She dressed in the barn coat and a pair of Thomas's old work boots that were slightly too large for her, and she went out to the pickup truck because she had learned long ago that a drive at that hour was better than another hour of sealing. The road east towards the coast ran empty at that hour, the way coastal roads do in Maine before dawn, with nothing moving in the headlights but the occasional fox crossing between stone walls. She had no destination in mind. She simply drove. And when she found herself passing the turnoff to Harrow's Point, the fish market that had stood at the edge of the harbor since her grandfather's time, she slowed without meaning to, because the loading dock was lit and busy, at an hour she had not known it kept. She pulled over. She got out. She walked in the barn coat and the 2 large boots toward the light and the smell of brine and diesel past pickups, with the tailgates down and men in rubber waders hauling crates of ice, and nobody stopped her because a woman of her age moving with quiet purpose in a small Maine town was assumed to have a reason. She did not yet know that her reason was already waiting at the far end of the dock. At the end of the dock stood 4 industrial dumpsters. Into them, from wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow, workers were pouring shells. Oyster, clam, mussel, scallop, tons of them. Sun-bleached, pale-ridged, glinting under the dock lights like something a receding sea had left behind, and no one had thought to collect. The dumpsters were nearly full. Another was being wheeled into position beside them. The pile at the base of the loading ramp was taller than her waist. She stood watching for a long time. In the back of her memory, uninvited, came the sound of Thomas's voice from a long summer evening, perhaps 20 years past, when they had been sitting on the porch after supper and he had been talking about his grandfather, the one who built the stone wall. His grandfather, he said, had worked crushed oyster shell into the garden every spring because his own grandfather before him had done it back when nobody had a name for what it did to the ground. There was calcium in it. There were minerals. It sweetened the soil, that was the old phrase for it. It made the dirt breathe. She had not thought about that conversation in 20 years. She thought about it now with the sharpness of a woman who had just recognized a name in a crowd. She stepped closer to the dumpsters. "What happens to all of it?" she asked the man loading the nearest wheelbarrow. He looked up, surprised to find her there, and then shrugged the shrug of a man who has answered pointless questions in cold weather for most of his working life. "Hauled off, ma'am. Twice a week. Cost the market a small fortune if you want the honest answer. Landfill fees keep going up. Nobody wants shell waste. It's the ugliest kind of trash there is." "How much of a fortune?" she asked. He gave her a number. It was several $1,000s a year. She held that number in her mind the way a jeweler holds a stone up to a lamp. A second man walked over, then older, heavier through the shoulders, with the weathered squint of someone who had watched the harbor for a long time and had learned to read weather in it. His name, he offered, was Errol Kincaid, and he had managed the dock at Harrow's Point for 21 years. He asked her not unkindly what a woman like her was doing at his dumpsters at 3 in the morning. She told him her name. She told him she had a piece of land 3 miles inland. She told him she would like if he was willing to haul away his shell waste for him, all of it if he could spare it, as often as he could give it, at no charge to the market. He looked at her carefully. He did not laugh. In a lifetime spent around fishermen, Errol Kincaid had learned to distinguish the tone of a person who had gone slightly mad from the tone of a person who had just decided something. Eleanor's tone was the second one. For what purpose, he asked. She hesitated, and then she said honestly, "My garden." Something like that. "Something like that," he repeated. Then more slowly, "All right, bring the truck. Bring it as often as you like. I'll have my boys load it for you. Costs the market nothing and saves them plenty. I'll tell the day crew you're coming." She thanked him. She turned to leave. Mrs. Whitfield, she stopped. She looked back. Errol Kincaid was watching her with an expression she could not quite read, though it had something of warning in it and something of respect. "You're not the first person to come asking about the shells," he said. "3 years back, another fella had an idea. He wanted to build something out of them out here in this county. Fertilizer soil. I don't remember what he called it. He was serious about it. He put money into it." "What happened?" she asked. Errol Kincaid looked out toward the harbor, where the running lights of a dragger were just becoming visible against the dark. "He didn't finish," was all he said. "Somebody made sure of it. Nothing I can prove. But I've been on this dock a long time, and I know when a man gets discouraged on his own, and when he gets discouraged with help." He turned his eyes back to her. "I'm not telling you not to try, ma'am. I'm telling you not to try quietly. Quiet is what they count on." Eleanor drove home in the first gray light of dawn, with the truck bed rattling under the weight of nothing yet, and Errol Kincaid's words folded carefully into the back of her mind beside the small business card of Harlan Pruitt. Two pieces of information from two different men in two different places, and they did not touch each other, and yet already she felt them beginning to reach. The library at Harrow's Point occupied a single room above the post office and was open 3 afternoons a week, run by a retired schoolteacher named Adelaide Voss, who could remember every book Eleanor had checked out since 1962. Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs on a Tuesday afternoon with a list in her pocket she had written by hand the night before, and she asked Adelaide without ceremony whether the library still kept the old agricultural extension bulletins from the university. Adelaide's eyes brightened the way the eyes of librarians do when someone asks for something no one has asked for in 20 years. She led Eleanor to a back room whose smell was the particular smell of paper that had been undisturbed for a long time, and she pulled down 3 cardboard boxes from a high shelf, and she left Eleanor alone with them in a wooden chair in the afternoon light coming through a small window that faced west. Eleanor read for 4 hours. She read about calcium carbonate and its slow release in acidic soils. She read about the shell middens the coastal peoples had built up over thousands of years, and about how the ground around those middens, wherever archaeologists dug, was darker and richer than the ground beside them. She read about pH balance. She read about the microscopic life that could not survive in soil that had been leached of minerals, and about how, when minerals returned, that life returned with them, sometimes within a single season. She read something else, too. She read about how the process required patience. Raw shell put directly into soil would do very little. Shell had to be crushed. It had to be aged. It had to be blended with compost with seaweed, if seaweed was available, with wood ash for potassium in the right proportions and at the right stages of decomposition, or it would either release too slowly to matter or too quickly to help. She copied everything by hand into a spiral notebook. She checked out 3 of the Boltons, the ones Adelaide would let her take. She drove home in the falling light with the notebook on the seat beside her, and for the first time in weeks, she did not eat supper alone in silence, because she was reading while she ate, and reading for a woman who had grieved for 3 weeks was a form of company. The homemade crusher took her 6 days to build. She had no funds for equipment. She had a wood chipper Thomas had bought at auction in 1996 that ran, when it felt like running an 8-pound mallet that had belonged to his father, 4 sheets of half-inch plywood, a stack of 2x4s, and the stubbornness of a woman who had been told by 3 neighbors to give up. She built a wooden frame that funneled shell into the chipper's intake. She built a screen to catch what came out. She built a second stage where the coarser fragments could be broken down further with the mallet on a plywood platform. The first load she hauled from Harrow's Point filled the pickup bed to the wheel wells. She unloaded it by herself, 1 shovelful at a time, into a heap at the edge of the barn where the sun would reach it. Her back hurt that night in a way it had not hurt in years. Her hands, when she washed them, were red and cracked at the knuckles. She wrapped them in a warm towel. She slept without dreaming. The next morning, she started the chipper on the third pole. She fed shell into it for 2 hours before the motor gave out. She rested the chipper. She restarted it. She worked in 1-hour bursts through the middle of the day, the way she had learned from Thomas to work old equipment, and by evening she had a heap of coarse crushed shell, perhaps the size of a bushel basket, and she had begun to understand exactly how long the coming work was going to take. She started small. She marked out a half-acre at the west end of the worst field, the piece of ground closest to the barn where the soil was so pale and dry that even weeds struggled in it, and she committed that half-acre to the experiment. She spread the crushed shell across it in a thin, even layer. She turned it in by hand, where the tractor had trouble because the tractor had trouble almost everywhere now. She added compost from a pile Thomas had kept going behind the barn for as long as she could remember, and which she had, by some quiet instinct, continued to feed through the winter without asking herself why. The half-acre began within days to smell. It was not the ordinary smell of a compost pile. It was sharper, briny, unmistakably marine, and it carried in the wind. On the third day of the smell, Silas Thornton walked over from his side of the stone wall and stood at the edge of her field with his hands in his coat pockets and did not say hello. "Eleanor," he began, and this time his voice was not gentle. "We can smell that clear across the pasture. My wife's been asking me what in the world you've got going on over here, and I don't have a good answer for her." She did not stop shoveling. "It's going to smell for a while, Silas. It'll pass." "For a while," he repeated. "How long is a while?" She stopped then. She leaned on the shovel. She looked at him across the low stone wall Thomas's grandfather had laid 100 years earlier, and said with a calm she did not entirely feel, "I don't know yet, but I know it will pass. And I know what I'm doing, and I'm asking you to trust that because I've been your neighbor for 41 years and I've never asked you for much." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he tipped his hat. He walked back the way he had come. He did not, however, tell her the thing she would find out for herself within a week, which was that he had not been the only one across the wall who could smell it, and that talk had begun already at the feed store and after church and in the booths at Ruby's diner about the Whitfield widow and the smell rolling off her north field. Ruby's diner sat on the main road 2 miles into town in a low white building that had not been painted in 11 years and did not need to be. It had 8 booths, 6 stools at the counter, and a coffee pot that had never in living memory been allowed to run dry. The men who ate breakfast there every morning were the men who ran the small businesses of Harrow's Point, the feed store, the hardware, the boatyard, the mill. And the man at the corner booth who ate breakfast there most mornings that spring in a canvas coat with the collar turned up and a copy of the county paper folded beside his plate was named Wendell Marsh. He was 56 years old. He was broad through the chest and thick through the hands, and he had a face that had been handsome 20 years ago and had settled since into something more calculating. He owned Marsh Agri Supply, which sat at the north end of the Harbor Road and was the exclusive distributor of a certain brand of nitrogen fertilizer that had over the last decade become almost the only fertilizer sold to the small farms of the county. This exclusivity had made him, if not wealthy, then comfortable, in a way most men in Harrow's Point were not. He drove a new pickup every 3 years. He kept a boat at the marina. He tipped Ruby generously enough that she kept his coffee filled without being asked. On the second Friday of April, Wendell Marsh looked up from his paper as one of the deckhands from Harrow's Point came in for coffee and said, half laughing, that the Whitfield widow had been at the dock 3 times that week to haul away shell. "Loaded her truck herself," the deckhand said. "Errol says she's going to take the whole pile if they let her." The men at the counter laughed. Wendell laughed too, because laughing was what the moment called for. But his eyes went still in a way that Ruby, who had been watching men's eyes over her counter for 31 years, noticed and did not comment on. He folded the paper. He drank the rest of his coffee. He left a bill on the table and walked out into the parking lot and stood there in the cold for a long moment before he got into his truck. His fertilizer business depended on one simple fact, which was that the soils of the small farms of Harrow's Point had grown steadily poorer over the last 15 years, and the poorer they grew, the more his customers needed him. He did not need a widow with a truck and a wood chipper to change that arithmetic. He did not at that early hour know whether she could change it, but he had learned long ago that the time to notice a small thing was when it was still small, before it had a chance to grow into something he could not easily undo. He drove back to the store. He made a phone call. He did not say much on the call. He listened. He hung up. He looked out through the plate glass at the harbor road for a long time. Eleanor did not know any of this. Eleanor was on that same Friday afternoon, standing in the middle of her half-acre with a shovel in her hand, spreading a fresh layer of aged shell and turning it in with a rhythm her back had begun to relearn. The smell was worse that week than it had been the week before, and she knew it. She had walked to the edge of her property twice that morning to check whether the wind was carrying it towards Silas's house, and both times the answer had been yes. She kept working. By the end of April, the pile of raw shell beside the barn had grown to twice the size of the pickup. She had made 3 more runs to Harrow's Point. Errol Kincaid had begun to nod at her when she pulled in, and once, when the wind was blowing hard off the water, he had walked out to the truck and helped her tie down the tarp himself, though he had not spoken more than 5 words while he did it. She had also begun in the evenings to feel the first stirring of something that was not quite doubt but was adjacent to it. The half-acre still looked bad. It smelled worse. The crushed shell had not visibly changed the color of the soil beneath it. The book she was reading told her this was expected, that the process would take a full growing season at minimum. That patience was the essential ingredient. She believed the books. She also lay awake at night and wondered in the small hours whether her belief in the books was itself a kind of foolishness, whether the neighbors and Silas and Harlan Pruitt were right, and she was simply a widow who had refused to look plainly at what everyone else could see. On the last night of April, she was standing at the kitchen sink washing out a coffee cup when a pair of headlights appeared at the top of the farm road. They did not turn into the driveway. They stopped at the shoulder, perhaps 100 yards from the house, and they held their engine idling, low beams pointed toward the barn. She turned off the kitchen light. She stood back from the window. She watched. The truck did not move for perhaps 10 minutes. It was too far to make out a face, but she could see the silhouette of a broad-shouldered man behind the wheel, and she could see the small red glow of a cigarette rising and falling near the driver's window. She had not lived on this road for 41 years without knowing every set of headlights that belonged to it, and this set did not belong. It was a new pickup high off the road of a make she did not recognize. The cigarette went out. The truck sat a while longer. Then, without turning around, it backed slowly down the road and disappeared behind the row of pines that lined the property to the east. Eleanor stood at the window in the dark for a long time after it was gone. She thought about Errol Kincaid's face on the loading dock. "He didn't finish," was all he said. Somebody made sure of it. She thought about the smell and the neighbors and the bank letter under the salt shaker. She thought about the half-acre. She thought about Thomas. Then she walked into the entryway and picked up the phone and dialed the number Silas had given her years ago for the county sheriff's non-emergency line, and she almost dialed. She stopped. She set the phone back in its cradle because she understood, standing there in the dark kitchen with her hand still on the receiver, that whoever had been sitting at the top of her road had not come to break anything or take anything. He had come to be seen. He had come so that she would understand in a way that words on paper could not have communicated that she was being watched. And a woman who knew she was being watched had 2 choices. She could stop what she was doing, Or she could keep doing it only louder, only more visibly, only with her porch light on. Eleanor walked to the entryway. She flipped the switch. The porch light came on and threw a wide yellow arc across the front yard and the beginning of the north field beyond it. She stood in the light for a full minute so that anyone still in the pines would see her clearly. Then she turned and went back into the house, and she did not turn the porch light off. Not that night, not the next night, not any night for the rest of what was coming. Upstairs, she sat down on the edge of the bed she and Thomas had shared, and for the first time she reached across it and rested her palm on the empty half, and she spoke to him plainly the way she had spoken to him plainly for 41 years. "They think I'll stop," she said. "They think I'll get frightened and take the money, and maybe I should. Maybe any sensible woman would." She closed her eyes. "But you always told me that the ground remembers what you put into it, and I have been putting more of myself into that ground these last 3 weeks than into anything since the day we buried you. So I don't think I'm going to stop, Thomas. I don't think I know how." Outside the porch, light burned steady across the yard, across the pale March-turned April soil, across the low pile of shell beside the barn that in the dark could have been mistaken for a small hill of bone. And 3 miles down the road at the north end of the harbor, in a store that had already closed for the night, a light was on above a desk in a back office, and a man was making a second telephone call, and the arithmetic that had begun in a room to which Eleanor had not yet been invited was at that moment being written down. May came into Harrow's Point the way it always came on a wind that could not decide whether it belonged to winter or summer, and with a light that lay along the fields for longer each evening until the shadows of the fence posts reached nearly to the porch steps. Eleanor Whitfield rose at 4 every morning that month, made her coffee, pulled on the barn coat, and walked out to the pile behind the barn before the birds had begun. The pile had a shape now, it had layers. She had built it the way a mason builds a wall in courses, each course a different stage of the work, so that at any given time, some portion of the shell was raw and freshly hauled, some was being crushed, some was aging, some was being blended with the compost Thomas had kept alive behind the barn for as long as she could remember. She had begun to think of the pile the way a woman thinks of a slow bread rising in a warm kitchen. It was not the kind of work that answered to hurry. Her body did not agree. Her shoulders had gone through the first stage of soreness and out the other side into a duller, deeper ache that no longer left her at the end of the day. Her hands cracked along the base of the thumb where the shovel handle rode. She wrapped them in strips of an old flannel shirt of Thomas's each night. She did not tell anyone how much they hurt. There was no one left to tell. The tractor finally gave out on the 12th of May. It happened in the middle of a run down the length of the half-acre with a bucket of crushed shell balanced on the loader. The engine coughed once, it coughed again. It stopped without ceremony, sitting there in the sun with the loader half raised, and when she climbed down and lifted the hood, the smell that came out of it was the smell of an old animal that had finally lain down. She stood beside the tractor for a long time with her hand resting on the warm metal of the fender, the way she had once rested her hand on Thomas's shoulder when there was no useful thing to say. The mechanic she called out from town was a young man named Cyril Boothby, who had learned his trade from his father, who had learned it from his grandfather, who had once in another century repaired the very tractor that now sat dead in Eleanor's field. Cyril spent 40 minutes with his head under the hood. He wiped his hands on a rag. He gave her the number honestly, because honesty was what his father had trained him to give, and the number was more than she had in the checking account by a factor of 3. She thanked him. She paid him for the visit. She watched his truck go down the farm road, and then she walked back to the tractor and pushed the bucket down by hand with her boot on the release and let the loader rest against the ground. Whatever the shell needed moved from that point forward would be moved by wheelbarrow. By her wheelbarrow, by her. She started the next load before Cyril's dust had settled. The complaints reached the county office on the 15th of May. Eleanor did not learn of them until the 21st, which was the day a plain white county pickup came slowly up her drive, and a man in a green windbreaker with a clipboard stepped out and introduced himself as Bertram Halloway, Senior Environmental Inspector for the county. He was 60 years old, thin, with riding glasses hanging from a cord around his neck, and he wore the expression of a man who had spent his career listening to people explain themselves and had learned to draw no conclusions until the paperwork was in front of him. He was sorry to trouble her, he said. He had received a signed complaint, multiple signatures, in fact, a petition. Odor emissions from the Whitfield parcel were, according to the petitioners, creating a public nuisance and a possible public health concern. He was required by county code to conduct an inspection. He was required by county code to issue findings. He wanted her to understand not the one who had filed the complaint. He was merely the man the county sent when complaints came in. She showed him the pile. She showed him the half-acre. She showed him the notebook where she had recorded in her careful hand the composition and dates of every layer. He read the notebook the way a man reads a will. He asked her the pH of her compost. She told him. He asked her the ratio of shell to seaweed to wood ash. She had not yet added the seaweed. She had not yet added the wood ash. She was still working through the early phase of the process. He wrote something on the clipboard. He wrote something else. Bertram Halloway did not raise his voice. He did not tell her she was wrong. He told her kindly that under county code section, such and such, he was obligated to issue a 30-day cease order pending further evaluation. She would need to stop hauling new shell to the site. She would need to cover the existing pile. If at the end of 30 days the odor persisted at levels the department considered a nuisance, she would be subject to fines of $100 per day, and if she failed to remediate within 90 days, the county would have grounds to place a lien against the parcel to cover cleanup costs. He handed her the order. He was sorry, he said again, and this time she thought she heard something more than the phrase itself, something like a quiet apology from one worker to another. Who filed it, she asked, because there was no reason not to ask. Bertram Halloway looked at the clipboard. His mouth worked slightly. Multiple signatures, he said. It's a matter of public record if you want to see the petition itself. It's filed at the county clerk's office. She thanked him. She walked him back to his truck. She stood in the drive as the county pickup rolled away, holding the folded order in her hand the way a woman might hold a letter delivering news too large to open in company. The county clerk's office was in the basement of the courthouse in town, and it was open until 3:30 on Wednesdays, which was fortunate because it was already Wednesday afternoon when Eleanor drove into town. She parked in the small lot behind the building. She walked down the stone steps. She asked for the petition by its docket number, which was printed at the top of the order Bertram Halloway had handed her. The clerk brought it out in a manila folder. Eleanor read it standing at the counter. The complaint was written in the careful language of a lawyer, though it was not signed by one. Beneath the text ran the signatures. 17 names, some she did not know. Some she knew slightly, the sorts of people whose farms bordered the town rather than the coast, who had no reason to smell her pile from where they lived. Silas Thornton's name was not on the list, and something in her chest, which had gone cold at the sight of the folder, loosened a small measure at his absence. At the top of the signatures, printed in block capitals beside a fluid handwritten signature she had seen on invoices at the feed store, was one name, Wendell Marsh. She looked at the name for a long moment. Then she thanked the clerk. She walked out of the courthouse into the pale afternoon light. She sat in her truck in the parking lot without turning the key. She had not until that moment been entirely certain. There had been the headlights at the top of the road. There had been Errol Kincaid's warning at the dock. There had been the small unease she had carried since the second week of April. But suspicion and certainty are two different animals, And Eleanor Whitfield had lived long enough to know that a woman must be careful not to promote the one to the other without proper cause. She had her proper cause now. She had it in ink. She sat with it in the truck for perhaps 5 minutes, and when she finally turned the key, her hands were steady in a way they had not been steady since the funeral. Somebody had drawn a line. She had a choice about which side of the line to stand on. She drove home. The rain came on a Thursday night at the end of May, the kind of rain that arrived on the coast without much warning and stayed for 3 days, coming in off the Atlantic in long sheets driven by a wind that bent the pines. Eleanor lay in bed listening to it for most of the first night. She got up twice to look out the window at the shape of the pile behind the barn under the yard light. The tarp she had thrown over it, the one Bertram Halloway had asked her to keep in place, snapped and lifted in the wind. She went down in her nightgown and boots at 2 a.m. to weigh it with more stones. She was soaked to the skin by the time she came back inside. By the second night, the field behind the barn had turned to mud. She could see from the kitchen window water running in dark ribbons down the slope toward the low ground at the edge of the creek. She pulled on the barn coat over her nightgown. She went out with a lantern. The pile was still there, most of it, but the slope beneath it had begun to move, and the runoff was carrying a slurry of shell fragments and aging compost down into the low ground faster than she could grasp. She stood in the rain with the lantern held out at arm's length and watched perhaps a month's worth of labor slide in dark streaks toward the creek. There was nothing to be done in the middle of a storm at 3 a.m. that would not have made the erosion worse. She knew this. She knew it the way any farmer's wife knew it. She stood in the rain anyway because to walk back into the house and close the door would have been to give it permission. She stayed until she was shaking with cold. Then she came in. She sat down at the kitchen table in her wet nightgown. She put her face in her hands, and for the first time since the morning of Thomas's funeral, when she had held herself upright at the church door for the sake of the mourners, who needed her to hold herself upright, she wept without restraint. She wept the way a person weeps when there is no one in the house to hear it and no reason to pretend otherwise. She wept for the pile. She wept for the tractor. She wept for the petition and the 17 names and the man who had gathered them. She wept for Thomas. She wept for the woman she had been the day before she stood at the edge of the north field and let the dust of her own land drift through her fingers. The rain stopped on the third morning. The sun came up slowly, uncertain of itself, and the field steamed. Eleanor walked out with her second cup of coffee and stood at the edge of the pile. What remained was perhaps half of what had been there. The rest lay in dark streaks across the slope and in a narrow bar of debris where the creek had risen and fallen. It would take weeks to recover. It would take weeks she did not have because the cease order still lay folded on the kitchen counter, and every day of it was a day the pile was not aging correctly. The car came at 11 that same morning. She heard it before she saw it, the low, steady hum of an engine, unlike the trucks and pickups that use the farm road. She knew before it turned into her drive who it would be. Harlan Pruitt stepped out in the same wool coat he had worn in April, though the coat was too warm now for the season, which told her he had not planned to be out of the car for long. He carried the same leather folder. He walked up the porch steps with the same measured pace. She met him at the door before he could knock. "Mrs. Whitfield," he began, and his voice carried, if she was hearing it correctly, a small note of sympathy that had not been there in April. "I heard about the storm. I'm sorry for your trouble." She waited. He went on. "My clients have asked me to revise our earlier offer. Given the changing circumstances of the property, they are prepared to significantly increase what they discussed with you last month. Doubling it, in fact." He named the new number. It was indeed twice the first. It was enough to clear the mortgage, replace the tractor, and leave her a comfortable sum for the years ahead. He said it without pressure. He said it the way a man says a word to a horse he is trying not to spook. She held the door with the flat of her palm the way she had held it for Silas Thornton in April. She thought about the pile. She thought about the county order under the salt shaker. She thought about the 17 names. She spoke slowly so that he would understand her the first time. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "tell me one thing honestly, and I will consider your offer. What do your clients see in this land that everyone else has already given up on?" He did not blink. His smile did not falter. That would not be information he could share, he told her. Client confidentiality. He was certain she understood. "I do understand," she answered. Then she stepped back and she closed the door. She stood behind it with her forehead against the wood and listened to his footsteps go down the porch steps and to the car door open and close and to the low hum of the engine receding down the road. Only when the sound was gone did she straighten and turn and walk into the kitchen. She sat at the table where she had wept the night before. She opened the notebook. She read back through her own careful entries, 3 months of them, and she read them the way an outsider might read them, looking for the things she had missed. It came to her not as a sudden revelation, but as an old memory rising slowly the way memories rise in a woman who has spent enough time in one house. Thomas on a summer evening, perhaps 15 years past, sitting on the porch with a jar of iced tea. He had been talking about his grandfather again, the one with the shells in the garden. His grandfather, he had said, always insisted that shells needed time. "You cannot rush a shell," Thomas had told her, laughing at the old man's phrasing. He said the shell has to remember it was once alive before it will give itself back to the ground. My grandfather thought about dirt the way other men thought about scripture. She had laughed with him. She had refilled his glass. She had not thought about the conversation again for 15 years. She thought about it now. She thought about her pile. She thought about how she had been layering it, how she had been turning it, how she had been trying without perhaps realizing it to hurry the work. She had been feeding raw shell into the compost too quickly. She had not been letting it lie. She had not been giving it time to break down into itself before asking it to break down into anything else. She looked at the notebook. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote down in a hand that had gone steadier since morning 3 words: seaweed, wood ash, time. She thought about the beach at the base of the point road where the storm would have thrown a fresh line of kelp above the tide line. She thought about the wood stove in the parlor and the metal bucket beside it which she had been emptying into the compost without measure for years. Wood ash contained potassium. Kelp contained nitrogen and trace minerals. Both had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. She stood up from the table. She put on the barn coat. She walked out to the truck. The beach was empty at that hour on a weekday morning. The storm gone, the sky washed clean. The tide had left a heavy line of kelp along the sand, dark and glistening in the sun, and Eleanor spent the better part of the afternoon gathering it into feed sacks in the bed of the pickup. Her back ached. Her hands ached. She sang under her breath, and without knowing that she was doing it, an old hymn Thomas had liked, the one about the sower going forth to sow. She had not sung anything since March. She hauled the kelp home. She spread it in a fresh layer over what remained of the pile. She emptied every metal bucket of wood ash from the parlor in the barn into a second layer. She covered the hole with a tarp again, and this time she weighted it not with stones but with old fence rails she had dragged from behind the barn one at a time until the tarp lay so flat against the pile that even the coastal wind could not lift its corners. Then she sat down on the porch step. She looked out at the north field and the half-acre and the pile and the tarp. She said aloud, "To know when we start again, Thomas, and this time we let it remember." The hearing at the county seat was set for the 3rd Wednesday in June. Eleanor received the notice by mail the day after her second attempt at rebuilding the pile had passed its 10-day mark, which was the mark at which the notebook told her the seaweed and ash should begin to take. She read the notice twice. She placed it on the kitchen counter beside the mortgage letter and the cease order. She did not sleep well that night or the next or the next. The hearing room at the county building held perhaps 40 people. The county board sat behind a raised wooden bench at the front. The petitioners and the respondent sat at two tables on the floor before the bench, and the public was permitted to fill the benches at the back if they wished. On the Wednesday morning of the hearings, a benches filled. Word had moved through Harrow's Point the way word moved through small towns, and by the time Eleanor walked in through the double doors at the back of the room was already three-quarters full, and the murmur that ran along the benches was the murmur of a town that had come to see what it had been talking about. She had dressed carefully that morning. The dark blue skirt she had last worn to Thomas's funeral, a white blouse with a small collar, her hair pinned back the way she had worn it every morning for 41 years. She carried a canvas satchel in one hand. In the other, wrapped in a clean tea towel, she carried a mason jar. At the petitioner's table sat Wendell Marsh in a pressed sport coat, and beside him, a lean man in a suit whose name was Odell Merriweather, and who was she learned from the docket sheet an attorney out of the county seat. Wendell did not look at her when she entered. The attorney did, and his expression was the expression of a man who has already tried the case in his own head and has liked how it came out. The county board chairman was a woman of about her age named Lucinda Barrow, a retired school principal from the inland part of the county who had served on the board for 11 years and had on more than one occasion cast the deciding vote on matters no one else would touch. She called the hearing to order. She read the docket. She invited the petitioners to present. Odell Merriweather stood. He walked to the small podium between the two tables. He spoke for 22 minutes. He spoke of odor. He spoke of the 17 signatures. He spoke of respectable citizens who had opened their windows in April and been driven back into it by the smell. He spoke of decomposition of biological hazard, of the risks unregulated waste posed to groundwater, and to the reputation of the town as a place where families might wish to live. He spoke of expert opinion. He held up a 2-page document he described as a scientific assessment. He read from it. Marine calcium waste insufficiently processed could emit hydrogen sulfide at concentrations detectable to the human nose, which meant he told the board that the concentrations were also detectable to the human lung. His voice was warm and measured. He did not once look at Eleanor. He sat down. Lucinda Barrow invited the respondent to present. Eleanor stood. She walked to the podium with the canvas satchel and the mason jar. She set the jar on the podium. She unwrapped the tea towel from around it, folded the towel, tucked it into the satchel. She adjusted the small microphone. She had not spoken publicly since the day she had stood at the front of the church and said a few brief words about Thomas, and her throat closed for a moment, now the way it had closed then. She took a breath. She looked out over the room and she began. "I am not a scientist," she said. "I am a woman who has farmed the same 18 acres for 41 years. My husband is buried 2 miles from where you sit. He would have liked to be here today. He is not, so I am." The room did not stir. The room listened. "The gentleman who spoke before me," she went on, "is correct. That shell waste can decompose in ways that give off unpleasant smells. He is also correct that the piles on my land in the early stages of my work have produced smells my neighbors did not enjoy. I am sorry for that. I would be sorry for that even if no one had asked me to be." She paused. She turned the mason jar in her hands so that the label she had written on it faced the board. "But what the gentleman did not tell you," she said, "is what is at the end of the process. He described the beginning of a story and asked you to close the book without reading the rest. So I have brought the ending with me." She lifted the jar. She unscrewed the lid. She tipped a small handful of dark, crumbling soil into her open palm, and she held her palm out toward the board. "This is from the half-acre I have been treating since April," she said. Under the pile beneath the tarp, 12 inches down. 6 weeks ago, this soil was the color of old bone. 6 weeks ago, you could crush it in your hand to powder, and any earthworm that tried to live in it would have died. Today, if you would care to look, it is dark, it is friable, it is full of life. There are 3 earthworms in this jar as I speak. I did not put them there. They put themselves there because the ground has begun to remember what it was meant to be. She passed the jar to Lucinda Barrow, who took it with both hands. I have here as well. Eleanor continued, opening the satchel, 3 bulletins from the State Extension Office, published between 1954 and 1978, on the subject of crushed marine shell as a soil amendment. I have here soil test results from the half-acre taken by a certified lab in Portland at my own expense last month. The pH readings are on the top page. The mineral counts are on the second. I have here photographs of the field taken in 3-week intervals since April. I am not asking the board to take my word for anything. I am asking the board to look at what is in front of it. She placed the documents on the bench. Odell Merriweather shifted in his chair. Wendell Marsh did not shift. Wendell Marsh watched her with an expression that had gone very still. Lucinda Barrow turned the mason jar slowly in her hands. She peered at the soil. She reached in with 2 fingers and lifted a small clump. It broke apart easily against her thumb. She looked at Eleanor over the top of her reading glasses. The board deliberated for 18 minutes. When they returned, the vote was 4-1 to vacate the cease order contingent on Eleanor's continued use of the tarp cover and continued documentation of her process. The single dissenting vote came from a board member whose brother-in-law happened to sit on the retail council of Marsh Agri Supply, which was not a fact the record noted, but which was a fact everyone in the room understood. Eleanor walked out of the hearing room into the corridor. Silas Thornton was standing there. She had not known he was in the room. He had not sat where she could see him. He held his hat in his hand. He nodded to her once. He did not say anything. She nodded back. He walked with her to the parking lot without speaking, and only when they reached her truck did he clear his throat and say quietly, "My wife wanted me to tell you that if you have any of that dirt to sell, she'd like a bushel for her tomatoes." Eleanor smiled for the first time in a month. By the middle of July, the half-acre was no longer a matter for anyone's imagination. Where the rest of the north field lay pale and thin under the summer sun, the half-acre lay dark, damp, alive. Eleanor had planted it in the first week of June with tomatoes, summer squash, and 3 long rows of leafy greens, and by mid-July the tomatoes were setting fruit heavier and thicker than anything she had grown in 15 years. The squash leaves were the size of dinner plates. The greens were sturdy at the stem and deep green at the leaf. Even the 2 old apple trees at the edge of the half-acre, which she had assumed for years were dying, had put out a heavier flush of foliage than they had shown in a decade. Silas Thornton walked over at the end of the first week in July with his hands in his coat pockets, though he was not wearing a coat, only a work shirt, and the gesture was the gesture of a man who did not know quite what to do with his hands. He stood at the low stone wall. He looked at her tomatoes. He looked at his own tomatoes, which were visible over his shoulder in the near distance, and which were by any honest measure a full third smaller. He turned back to her. "Eleanor," his voice was different than it had been in April. "What did you do to this dirt?" She told him, plainly, without exaggeration. Crushed shell aged and composted with kelp and wood ash and thyme worked into the soil over a full season. He listened. He asked questions. He asked to see the pile behind the barn. She walked him over. He put his hand on the tarp. He asked if she had any extra, whether she might be able to spare a couple of sacks. She filled 2 burlap sacks for him from the finished layer. She refused payment. She told him to try it on a corner of his own garden and to come find her if it did anything he wanted to talk about. He came back 3 weeks later. This time he was pulling a small trailer behind his pickup. His wife wanted 6 sacks. His brother who farmed inland wanted a dozen. His brother's neighbor had asked whether Eleanor could supply on some kind of regular basis. Silas set his hat on the porch rail and looked at her steadily. Eleanor, he said, I owe you an apology. I have not yet figured out how to make. So I'll pay you cash today for what I take, and I'll help you load, and we'll consider the apology started. She took his money because he needed her to take it. She helped him load. Word moved through Harrow's Point the way water moves through a dry field, finding its own channels, going where it was needed. By the first week of August, she had begun packaging soil in plain paper sacks with a handwritten label reading in her careful print, Brookside Organic Soil Whitfield Farm. She sold from the back of the pickup at the small farmers market on Saturdays. She sold from the porch on weekdays to people who now made the drive out to the farm on purpose. She kept a ledger in a spiral notebook. The numbers in the ledger surprised her by the middle of the month and continued to surprise her through September. By late September, I could no longer keep up. An organic farm 2 towns over placed an order for 800 pounds. A plant nursery on the coast road asked if she could supply them monthly. A vineyard in the inland hills run by a couple who had heard about her through the extension office sent a request for a formal quotation on 3 tons. She could not haul 3 tons alone in a single lifetime, and she knew it. So she did the thing that a year earlier would have seemed impossible. She drove into town on the last day of September, walked into the small storefront that had once been the office of the Harrow's Point Canning Company before the cannery had shut down 2 years earlier, and she asked at the front desk if the Community Assistance Office kept a list of workers who were still looking for steady employment. They did. They had a long list. She sat with the coordinator, a woman named Prudence Halsey, for the better part of an hour, and she came away with 3 names. The first name was Dwight Kessler, 42 years old, married, 1 child, another on the way. He had worked the cannery floor for 11 years before the closure. He had spent the 18 months since taking odd jobs, none of them steady. Eleanor met him at the farm on a Thursday morning. He shook her hand firmly. He looked her in the eye when he spoke. He said when she asked why he wanted the work that his wife was tired of watching him worry and that he was tired of being watched. She hired him. The second name was Rosalind Ainsley, 55 years old, divorced, no children at home. She had run the office at the cannery for 19 years. She could keep a ledger place in order and answer a telephone with the same calm hand. Eleanor hired her for the office work she was already realizing she could not do herself in the evenings after 15 hours in the field. The third was a younger man named Corbin Blake, 29, a Navy veteran who had come home to Harrow's Point 2 years earlier and had been picking up work on lobster boats when he could. He had the shoulders for the shovel work. He had the quiet steadiness that Eleanor recognized because Thomas had had it too. She taught them herself. She walked them through the pile behind the barn. She showed them the notebook. She showed them the tarp. She showed them how to layer, how to turn, how to test the pH with the small kit she had bought from the extension office, how to blend the finished product into the paper sacks so that each sack weighed the same as every other sack. It took 3 weeks before she could trust any of them to work without her standing beside them. It took longer before she could trust herself to trust them. By the middle of October, Brookside Organic Soil from a farmer's market brand, sold out of a pickup bed, had become something closer to an actual small business. She had a shipping schedule. She had 3 regular commercial accounts. She had a ledger Rosalind kept in her careful hand and updated every evening at the kitchen table where Eleanor had once wept alone in a wet nightgown. She should have been happier than she was. She was not unhappy. She was tired, and she was watchful because the headlights had not come back to the top of her road since June, and the absence of headlights in a season when they had once come often told her something she did not yet know how to name. She found out on a Wednesday in late October. Rosalind came in from an errand at the feed store in town with a small brown paper sack under her arm. She set the sack on the kitchen table. She did not sit down. Eleanor, she said, and her voice was careful, and I saw this at the counter. They had a whole display of it. I bought one so you could see it yourself. She opened the sack. She lifted out a smaller paper bag, cream color with a printed label in a design that was almost but not quite the design Eleanor had been using since August. The label read Marsh Coastal Blend Premium Shell-Based Soil Amendment. Beneath it in smaller print ran the words distributed by Marsh Agri Supply, Harrows Point, Maine. The price sticker on the front showed a figure roughly 40% lower than what Eleanor had been charging for a bag of comparable size. Eleanor looked at the bag. She looked at Rosalind. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she asked quietly, when did they start carrying this? About 2 weeks ago, Rosalind answered. The clerk said Wendell brought it in mid-October. He told her he'd been developing the formula for months. He said he'd hired a consultant on the process. She said the display sold 6 bags on the first day. Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table. She turned the bag in her hands. She read the label. She read the ingredients. She read them a second time. Crushed marine shell aged compost organic supplements. The language was almost identical to the language on her own sacks. The ratios were not printed. There was no batch number. There was no processing date. There was no indication of how long the shell had been aged before packaging. She set the bag down. She looked at Rosalind. Where would Wendell Marsh have gotten a formula, Eleanor asked, that he had never had before, and that he could not have developed by himself in a matter of months, and that he could suddenly be selling at 40% less than mine? Rosalind did not answer. She did not have to. The two women looked at each other across the kitchen table, and they knew with a quiet certainty that did not require speech that the answer was sitting somewhere on Eleanor's payroll. That evening, Eleanor did not confront anyone. She did not raise her voice at anyone. She sat on the porch after Rosalind had gone home, and she watched the light drain out of the sky over the north field, and she thought carefully about which of the three she would need to watch first, and how she would watch him, and what she would do when she had confirmed what her chest had already told her. Dwight Kessler had a pregnant wife. Dwight Kessler had 3 days earlier asked if he could take his lunch break in his truck at the far end of the field where the reception was better, because his wife was near her time and he wanted to be reachable. Dwight Kessler had twice in the last week arrived 10 minutes before anyone else and stayed 10 minutes after everyone else, offering to close up the barn, offering to be helpful in ways that had struck her at the time as the ordinary eagerness of a man grateful for steady work. She sat on the porch until well after dark. When she stood up, her knees ached in the same way they had ached the morning she had knelt at the edge of the north field and let the dust of her own land drift through her fingers. That felt like a different woman's memory, now though it had been only 7 months. She walked into the house. She turned off the parlor lamp. She stood a moment in the dark front room, looking out through the window at the porch light still burning above the door, at the yard beyond it, at the road beyond the yard. At the top of the road, faint but unmistakable in the fall night, sat a set of headlights. They had come back. She looked at them a long time. She did not turn the porch light off. She turned instead and walked to the entryway, and she took Thomas's old barn coat from the hook, and she pulled it on over her house dress the way she had pulled it on every morning since March. She opened the front door. She stepped out onto the porch into the wide yellow arc of light. She walked down the steps. She walked to the middle of the yard in full view of the top of the road, and she stood there with her hands in the pockets of the coat, looking straight into the distant headlights. She did not shout. She did not wave. She simply stood, and she let herself be seen. She stood for a full minute, then 2, then 3. The headlights held. Then slowly they backed down the road the way they had backed away in April, and they were gone behind the pines. Eleanor stayed in the middle of the yard for another moment after they had gone. The air off the coast was cold now. October cold, carrying the first thin edge of the winter that was coming. She turned. She walked back up the porch steps. She stopped at the door. She rested her hand on the frame the way she used to rest her hand on Thomas's shoulder when there was no useful thing to say, and she spoke quietly to the empty yard and to whatever remained of the man who had once stood in this doorway with her. They think if they push hard enough, I'll fall, she said. They don't understand that I already fell. In March. in the kitchen with a coffee cup still warm on the table. Everything after that is standing back up. She went inside, she closed the door. She did not turn off the porch light. She did not turn it off that night, and she would not turn it off any night for what was still to come, because a woman who had learned to be seen was not going to unlearn it now. The morning after the headlights returned, Eleanor rose at 4 the way she had risen every morning since March, but she did not go out to the pile. She sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and the bag of Marsh Coastal Blend that Rosalind had brought her the day before, and she read the ingredient list a third time in the light of the electric bulb over the sink. She read it slowly. She turned the bag in her hands. She weighed it against a bag of her own that she had brought in from the barn for the purpose of comparison. The Marsh bag was lighter by perhaps a quarter pound. She did not confront Dwight that morning. She did not confront anyone. She drove into town at 8 past Marsh Agri Supply with its wide gravel lot and its new banner advertising the Coastal Blend at introductory pricing, and she continued on the coast road for another 11 miles until she reached the small mail-order supply house in the next town over, where she used a portion of the previous week's soil earnings to purchase 4 professional soil testing kits, 3 glass reagent bottles, a small digital pH meter, a jeweler's loop, and a set of fine sieves calibrated in decreasing mesh sizes. She paid in cash. She did not use the name Whitfield at the counter. She used her maiden name, which was Corley, because it occurred to her, standing at the register, that Wendell Marsh would have friends in more places than she had yet accounted for. At home in the barn, she set up a small workbench against the far wall where the light from the eastern window fell in the morning. She unbagged a cup of the Marsh product onto a clean sheet of butcher paper. She unbagged a cup of her own beside it. She ran both through the sieves in sequence. She spent the better part of the morning at the bench without breaking for anything but a fresh cup of coffee, working with the patience of a woman who had once at 14 taken a sewing machine apart on the kitchen floor because her mother had asked her to find out what was wrong with it, and no one else had wanted to try. What she saw at the finest mesh confirmed what she had suspected before she left the store the previous night. The Marsh shell had not been aged. The fragments still held their sharp edges. Some carried traces of organic residue that had not fully broken down. The pH meter dipped into a solution she prepared from a measured portion in distilled water, read almost a full point higher than the pH of her own material, which meant the Marsh product would burn the fine root hairs of any tender vegetable it touched within a season. Under the loupe in strong light, she could see thin, whitish crystals that ought not have been there in properly aged shell. She copied every reading into a fresh section of the notebook. She dated each entry. She signed her name beneath each one because she understood that a document might one day matter, and a document without a signature was only a piece of paper. She did not sleep well that night either, but the not sleeping had begun to feel less like grief and more like a woman turning something over in her mind until it fell into the shape it was meant to occupy. By the third morning, she had a plan. She did not go to the county board with what she had found. She did not go to the sheriff. She did not go to Wendell Marsh. She went to the extension office in the county seat, and she asked to see the man who ran the soil laboratory, whose name was Ambrose Talbot, and who had been the one who had processed her paid samples back in May. She showed him her side-by-side readings. She showed him the Marsh bag. She asked him plainly whether an independent laboratory analysis paid for at her expense would produce results a farmer could rely upon in deciding what to put on his land. Ambrose Talbot studied her notebook for perhaps 15 minutes. He looked up at her over his reading glasses. He told her that if she wanted, he could run a proper analysis himself on his own time for the cost of the reagents, and that he would sign his findings under his professional credential. He said he would do this because he had watched what the small farms of the county had gone through the last decade, and because his own father had once been sold a bag of feed by a man who had lied about what was in it, and he had never forgotten it. She left 3 samples of the Marsh product with him. She left 3 samples of her own alongside them for comparison. She drove home in the late afternoon with something in her chest she had not felt since June. Ambrose Talbot's analysis, printed on the letterhead of the state extension office, arrived by mail on the following Monday. It was clean, professional, and devastating. Every reading confirmed what her own crude tests had shown. It went further. The Marsh product tested positive for elevated levels of a sulfur compound that was expected only in shell that had been rushed through the composting process without proper aeration, and which, if applied at the rates the marsh bag recommended, could damage soil biology for 2 to 3 seasons before the ground could recover. The final paragraph, which Ambrose had added on his own initiative, noted that the sample tested was not recommended for agricultural use in its current form and should be considered raw shell waste rather than a finished amendment. She read the report twice. She folded it carefully. She placed it in a manila folder. She began that same evening at the kitchen table with Rosalind to draft a letter. She wrote it herself in longhand, and Rosalind typed each one clean on the small electric typewriter the office of the cannery had donated to the Community Assistance Program the year before. The letter was 2 pages. It did not attack Wendell Marsh. It did not use his name in a hostile way. It stated plainly that a product sold locally under the name Marsh Coastal Blend had been independently tested by the State Extension Office, and that the results were enclosed for the recipient's review. It offered at no charge a 5-pound sample of Brookside organic soil delivered by hand, along with a copy of Eleanor's own certified test results, so that any farmer might compare the two and reach his own conclusions. It closed with a single line: "I am not asking for your business. I am asking that you have the information before you decide." She and Rosalind identified from the ledger and from local knowledge the 73 farmers and gardeners in the 2-county area most likely to have purchased the Marsh product in the previous month. Eleanor spent the next 2 weeks delivering the letters and the samples herself, one address at a time, in the pickup truck on roads she had known for 40 years. She did not send Corbin. She did not send Dwight. She went alone because a letter delivered by hand from a woman standing on your porch could not be filed away as easily as a letter that came in the mail. At most of the doors, she was invited in. At some, she was received in the driveway. At 3, she was politely turned away without conversation. But at 70 of the 73, she left the sample bag on the porch or in the visitor's hands or on a kitchen counter, and she left the letter beside it, and she left the extension office report tucked inside the letter, and she said before she went only one thing: "Try the sample on a corner, compare it to whatever you have been using, then decide for yourself what you want in your ground." Word moved through the 2-county area faster than she had expected. By the second week of November, 6 of the 70 had called her to place orders. By the third week, 18. By the first week of December, farmers she had never delivered a letter to had begun calling because they had heard from a cousin or a neighbor. 2 of the small hardware stores in the coastal towns quietly pulled the Marsh Coastal Blend from their shelves. A third moved it to a back aisle and cut the price by half. The banner at the front of Marsh Agri Supply came down on the second Friday of December. It did not go back up. Eleanor did not celebrate any of it. She kept working. She kept the porch light on. The confrontation with Dwight Kessler came on a cold Tuesday in the second week of December, after the analysis had done its work, but before the harder work still ahead of her had begun. She waited until the end of the day. She waited until Corbin had gone home and Rosalind had closed the ledger and the barn was quiet. Dwight had stayed late again, sweeping down the mixing floor as he had begun to do most evenings. She stood in the barn doorway with the coat pulled around her and watched him work for perhaps a minute before he noticed her. When he saw her, his face changed. He set the broom down carefully against a post. He did not try to smile. Eleanor walked into the barn. She stopped 10 feet from him. She did not raise her voice. She spoke as if she were telling him something he already knew, which was, she understood exactly what she was doing. "Dwight," she said, "your wife's baby is due when—" He swallowed. "Second week of January. You told Wendell Marsh about the seaweed. You told him about the aging schedule. You told him about the wood ash. I don't need you to say whether you did. I need you to know that I know." He did not deny it. His shoulders went down, the way a man's shoulders go down when the thing he has been carrying alone becomes too heavy to hold at the moment it stops being a secret. He stood there for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "My wife needed the doctor visits. Wendell offered enough to cover the deposit at the hospital. I told myself it was just a formula. I told myself soil didn't belong to anyone." She looked at him a long time. He held her gaze. That was in its way more to his credit than she had expected. "I could report you to the county," she said. "I could report Wendell. I could probably ruin what's left of your working life in this town." I have thought about it. I sat on my porch and thought about it for 3 nights. I am not going to do it. Something in his face began to break. He put a hand on the post beside him to steady himself. You are going to work for me for another 20 years, Dwight, if you want to. But you are not going to work under Corbin anymore. Starting Monday, you are going to be my floor manager. You are going to be the man I ask when I want to know whether a batch is ready. You are going to be the man who trains every person I hire after you. You are going to earn back what you gave away by making sure it does not get given away again. And you are going to do this because I do not have the strength at 68 to teach 3 more people what you already know, and because your child is not going to grow up ashamed of what you did in the fall of this year. He was crying now quietly the way men who have not cried in a long time cry when they finally do. He did not wipe his face. He nodded. He said twice, "Thank you," though the second time it came out only as breath. She turned to go. She stopped at the door. Dwight, one more thing. If you ever one time take another dollar from Wendell Marsh or anyone like him, I will not have this conversation with you a second time. Are we understood? Yes, ma'am. She left him standing in the barn. She walked back to the house through the cold air. She did not tell Rosalind or Corbin what had happened. She never told anyone, in fact, for the rest of her life, though Dwight Kessler, on the morning of his daughter's wedding, 23 years later, would tell his daughter the story himself, standing outside the church in his one dark suit. The letter from Coastal Grain Holdings arrived on the 14th of January. It came on heavy stock, cream-colored with the corporate seal in the upper left corner and the return address of a legal office in Boston, though the signature at the bottom belonged to a man named Bradford Sinclair, Chief Executive Officer. The letter requested in courteous language an in-person meeting at Eleanor's earliest convenience. It named a figure at which Coastal Grain Holdings was prepared to purchase Brookside organic soil in its entirety, including intellectual property, existing contracts, physical inventory equipment, and the 18-acre parcel on which the operation was based. The figure was $2,400,000. Eleanor read the letter at the kitchen table with Rosalind sitting across from her. Rosalind read it after her. Rosalind set the letter down and looked at Eleanor and did not speak because Rosalind had learned over the 4 months she had worked at the farm that Eleanor did her thinking in silence and did not need help doing it. Eleanor folded the letter. She placed it on the counter beside the mortgage letter from the previous March, which she had not thrown away because there were certain pieces of paper a woman kept whether or not she still needed them. She wrote a short reply that same afternoon. She invited Mr. Sinclair to call at the farmhouse the following Wednesday at 10 in the morning. She noted that she would be prepared to receive him in her kitchen and that she would provide coffee. She signed the letter Eleanor Whitfield. She mailed it that evening from the post office in town before it closed at 5. Word moved through Harrow's Point again in the way word moved. By the following Monday, 3 separate neighbors had stopped by to tell her that they had heard about the offer and that they wanted her to know they thought she would be a fool not to take it. One of them was Silas Thornton. He said it kindly. He said it with his hat in his hands. He said that a woman of her age deserved to rest, that she had proved everything she had come to prove, that no one in the town would think anything but well of her for accepting. She thanked him. She did not tell him what she intended to do. She was not yet entirely certain she knew herself. She walked the north field on the Tuesday morning before the meeting. She walked the half-acre, which was under snow now, but which had produced over the growing season just past more per square foot than any parcel of comparable size in the county. She walked out to the barn where the finished sacks stood stacked to the rafters. She walked down to the small stone wall at the eastern edge, the one Thomas's grandfather had laid 106 years earlier. She stood there for a long time, her breath frosting the air, looking east toward the coast. She thought about the mortgage letter. She thought about the years ahead of her. She thought about how many years there were likely to be at 68 and how comfortable those years could be with $2,400,000 in the bank. She thought about Errol Kincaid on the dock the first morning, telling her that another man had tried once and had not finished. He didn't finish, was all he said. Somebody made sure of it. She thought about the 12 people who now depended on Brookside for their weekly wages, 3 of them full-time, year-round, the rest seasonal. She thought about the fishermen at Harrow's Point and at the 2 other markets who no longer paid to haul off shell. She thought about Dwight Kessler's daughter, who had been born on the 3rd of January, whose photograph Dwight had brought to work on his first morning back, and had set carefully on the shelf above his workbench. She thought about the men and women who had, over the last 4 months, opened their doors to her on porches from Bar Harbor to Rockland. She stood at the stone wall until her hands were numb inside the pockets of the barn coat. Then she walked back to the house. She went inside. She sat down at the kitchen table. She did not write anything. She did not rehearse anything. She had made up her mind in the way a woman of her age makes up her mind, which was not with speeches, but with the small settling of something in the chest that had been unsettled the whole way out to the wall and back. Bradford Sinclair arrived on Wednesday at 9:57 in the morning in a dark car driven by a man who stayed with the vehicle. Sinclair himself was perhaps 60 tall with silver hair, cut close, and he wore a wool overcoat over a suit. He carried a leather portfolio. He walked up the porch steps with the confident stride of a man who had walked up the steps of many porches in his career and had rarely left them empty-handed. Beside him walked Wendell Marsh. Eleanor had not been told that Wendell would be attending. She had not, however, been surprised to see him standing in the passenger seat of the dark car when it pulled into the drive. She opened the door before Sinclair could knock. She invited them both inside without ceremony. She showed them into the kitchen. She poured 3 cups of coffee from the pot she had made at 9. She set the cups on the table. She sat down. She did not offer sugar. Sinclair began with courtesy. He praised the coffee. He praised the farm. He praised what Eleanor had built. He said in the warm and measured cadence of a man who had spent his life closing rooms of this sort that his organization had been watching Brookside for some months now, and that they had come to believe her product was the finest of its kind on the eastern seaboard, and that they wished to help her carry the operation to a scale she could not at her age and alone hope to achieve. He gestured to Wendell. Mr. Marsh, he added, has been consulting with Coastal Grain on regional integration in the fertilizer sector for some time. He would remain following any acquisition as our local partner and operational lead. His expertise in distribution would be invaluable in scaling your product to a national market. Eleanor looked at Wendell. Wendell looked at his coffee cup. He did not drink from it. She turned back to Sinclair. She spoke slowly because she wanted him to hear each thing she said in its proper order. Mr. Sinclair, do you know when my husband died? He blinked. I do not, ma'am. He died on a Tuesday morning last March. He was 68 years old. He had a coffee cup in his hand. It was still warm when the ambulance got here. That coffee cup is in the cupboard behind you. I have not been able to bring myself to throw it away. Sinclair did not speak. She went on. 6 weeks after my husband died, a man came to this door and offered me a fair price for this farm. He would not tell me who he worked for. I found that out later from a business card he left me that he worked for you. That was in the 2nd week of April. I want you to understand what that means. It means that in the 6 weeks after I buried my husband, before I had done anything with this land, except walk it in the mornings before anyone in this town knew what I intended to try, before I had touched the first shell, your organization decided that this parcel was worth acquiring. She lifted her cup. She set it back down without drinking. You did not want the soil, Mr. Sinclair. You already had the soil analysis. You knew this land was tired. You wanted the parcel because 18 acres on the coast road held by a widow of 68 was easier to acquire than 18 acres held by anyone else in this county. You sent Mr. Pruitt because you thought I would take the number. When I did not, you doubled it in June after the rain washed half my pile down the slope. You thought I would take it then. When I did not, you waited. And when the analysis came out in November, and when Wendell's product was pulled from the shelves, and when Brookside began shipping to accounts, you could no longer reach through him. You decided it was time to come yourself and offer me a number that would make the previous numbers look like an insult. Sinclair's expression had not changed, but his hand had stopped moving on his cup. Wendell had not looked up from the table. Now Eleanor said, "Let me tell you what you are asking me to sell." She stood up. She walked to the cupboard behind Sinclair. She opened it. She took down the coffee cup Thomas had used the morning he died. She set it on the table between them. You are asking me to sell the last thing my husband touched in this world. You are asking me to sell the ground where his grandfather laid the stones. You are asking me to sell it to the same organization that came looking for it before he was cold, and to accept as your local partner the man who filed the county complaint against me in May, who sat outside my house in a truck at night in April, and again in October to see if he could frighten me off my own porch, who paid one of my employees to sell him a formula he then diluted and put on shelves at 40% below my price, and whose product, according to the State Extension Laboratory, will damage the soil biology of any field it is applied to for the next 2 seasons. Wendell's shoulders had gone very still. He did not lift his eyes. I am not going to sell it to you, Mr. Sinclair. I am not going to sell it for $2,400,000, and I am not going to sell it for $4,800,000, and I am not going to sell it for any number you would be prepared to offer me before you get back in your car this morning. And I will tell you why. She sat down again. She pushed the coffee cup on the table gently once so that it came to rest closer to his side than to hers. Because a piece of ground is not worth what a man will pay for it. It is worth what has been buried in it and grown out of it and paid for by the people who worked it. My husband is buried 2 miles down the road. My grandfather-in-law's hands are buried in the wall out back. My own last 4 decades are buried in the North Field. 12 people I now employ have a piece of themselves in this operation. 3 fish markets on this coast are cleaner because of what happens on this 18 acres. There is a young woman in Rockland who told me at her door in November that she had almost given up on her small vegetable operation before she tried my sample, and that she thinks now she can hold on for another year because of what she pulled out of her ground this fall. You cannot put a number on what has been buried and grown and lifted out of this land, Mr. Sinclair, because none of it belongs to me alone, and I do not have the right to sell what does not belong to me alone. The kitchen was quiet. The clock over the stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved along the eaves. Sinclair sat with the coffee cup between them for perhaps 20 seconds. Then he stood up. He put on his coat. He nodded once in a way that carried more of an acknowledgement than she had expected. He did not extend his hand. He walked out of the kitchen and down the hallway and out the front door, and his shoes on the porch steps were the shoes of a man who had understood at some point in the last 3 minutes that he had come to the wrong house. Wendell Marsh did not follow him immediately. He sat at the table another moment, staring at the untouched coffee cup in front of him. Then he stood too. He did not put on his coat. He held it in his hands. He looked at her. His mouth opened and closed and opened again. Eleanor, he began. She was not certain he had ever called her by her given name before. She waited. The words did not come. He looked down at the coat in his hands. He looked back at her. Whatever he had intended to say did not in the end come out of his mouth. He put the coat on. He walked out through the hallway and down the porch steps and got into the passenger seat of the dark car. The car pulled out of the drive. It turned left onto the coast road. It disappeared behind the pines. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with 2 full cups of coffee and Thomas's cup between them, and she did not move for a long time. When she finally stood up, she carried Sinclair's cup and Wendell's cup to the sink. She washed them. She set them upside down on the drying rack. Thomas's cup she carried carefully back to the cupboard, and she placed it exactly where it had been at the front of the second shelf, where she could reach it every morning without thinking. Marsh Agri Supply closed its doors in August of the following year. The closure was not sudden. Through the spring and into the summer, the customers Wendell had held for 15 years drifted away in 1s and 2s, going to the co-op in the next county or to Brookside directly, or in some cases, simply farming with less commercial fertilizer and more compost as their grandfathers had done. By July, his largest supplier had pulled his line of credit. By the second week of August, the storefront on the Harbor Road was dark, and a for sale sign had gone up in the window. Wendell did not attend the auction himself. His inventory was sold in lots. His truck was sold. The building was purchased by a young couple who intended to convert it into a bakery and small cafe. His house on the hill, which he had bought new in 1998, went into escrow in September. He was seen loading the last of his belongings into a rental truck on the 3rd of October. Eleanor was in the barn that morning. Rosalind came in to say that Wendell's truck was at the top of the road, that it had stopped, that he was sitting in it with the engine running. Eleanor set down the sack she was closing. She wiped her hands. She walked out to the porch. She stood in the wide yellow arc of the light, which she had never turned off in the 10 months since she had first begun leaving it on all night. Wendell's truck sat at the top of the drive, with the engine idling, the driver's window rolled down and Wendell behind the wheel looking down the road toward her. He did not get out. He did not shout. He did not make any gesture. She stood on the porch and looked back at him. She did not move. She did not smile. She did not scowl. She simply let him see her the way she had let him see her from the yard in October. He looked at her for perhaps 40 seconds. Then he rolled up the window. He put the truck in gear. He drove past the drive and continued down the coast road, and the truck grew small in the distance, and then it went around a curve and was gone. She did not know where he was going. She learned months later from a passing remark at the feed store that he had moved to a town in western Pennsylvania where he had a cousin. She did not ask further. She did not need to know. Certain kinds of knowing were a burden she had already carried long enough. The community meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the third week of October at the Methodist church in town because the church had the only room in Harrows Point large enough to hold the number of people who wanted to attend. Eleanor had put out the word through Rosalind and through the extension office and through the notice board at the feed store. She had not been certain how many people would come. The church was full by the time she rose from the front pew and walked up to the small podium beside the altar. She had prepared no speech. She had learned over the course of the year that speeches prepared in advance rarely said the thing that most needed saying. She looked out over the room. She saw Silas Thornton in the third row with his wife beside him. She saw Errol Kincaid, who had come inland from the dock for the first time in the 8 years she had known him. She saw Dwight Kessler holding his infant daughter, whose name she had learned was Ruth. She saw Corbin Blake and Rosalind Ainsley in the row behind him. She saw Bertram Halloway from the county in a plain coat and Ambrose Talbot from the extension office and Adelaide Voss from the library above the post office and Cyril Boothby the mechanic. She saw farmers she had delivered letters to in November of the previous year and fishermen from the 3 markets and women from her church and the young couple who had bought the agri-supply building and where she had heard planning to name their bakery Coastal Loaf. She began by thanking them for coming. Her voice was quieter than the microphone was ready for, and she had to lean in. "I have not gathered you here to tell you what a hard year it has been," she said. "You know what kind of year it has been. Some of you have lived it beside me. I have gathered you here to tell you what happens next." She placed her hands on the podium. Brookside Organic Soil, as most of you know, sold this fall at a level that would make it a profitable small business by any measure you cared to apply. We have contracts we did not have 6 months ago. We have accounts up and down the coast. I have received offers to sell the operation, one of them large enough that I could have retired and left this county for good. She paused. "I am not going to do that. What I am going to do is give the operation formally to the people who built it." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when they are not sure yet whether they have heard correctly. Starting on the first day of next year, she continued, "Brookside Organic Soil will be reorganized as a cooperative. Every full-time employee, along with our shell suppliers at Harrows Point, at Westcott Landing, and at Pemaquid, along with the growers who have signed as regular customers, will hold a share of ownership. The farm itself, these 18 acres, will remain in my name until my death, at which point it will pass to the cooperative, in trust on the condition that it continue to be worked as it has been worked this last year and a half. I will draw a manager's salary at the same rate as my floor manager. I will vote on the board as one member among many. That is all." She looked out at the room. "I did not build this alone. I am not going to keep it alone. My husband used to say to me that a farm is not what a person owns, but what a person is faithful to. I have been faithful to what I could reach. What I could reach turned out to be larger than I knew." She stepped back from the podium. The room did not at first applaud. The room sat still for a long moment in the way small towns sit still when they are trying to understand what has just happened. Then from the back row, one pair of hands began. Silas Thornton's, his wife joined him, then Errol Kincaid, then Dwight Kessler, still holding his daughter with one arm as he clapped with the other. Then the room. The applause went on longer than she had expected, and she stood at the front of the church with her hands folded in front of her the way she had folded them at the door of the church on the day of Thomas's funeral, and she let it come, because she understood standing there that most of it was not for her. 3 years passed the way years pass on a farm, which is to say in the accumulation of small mornings. The half-acre expanded over the second and third seasons into a full 6 acres of test ground and then into 10. The pile behind the barn grew into 3 piles at different stages and then into a proper aging yard with roof shelters and drainage channels dug by Corbin and Dwight, the summer of the second year. The office moved out of Eleanor's kitchen into a small building the cooperative erected beside the barn in the third year, where Rosalind kept the books during the day, and a younger woman named Persis Halstead answered the telephone. The employee count reached 14 by the end of the third year. The annual figures printed in the small brochure the cooperative published for its shareholders each January moved past 6 figures in the second year and stayed there. Eleanor turned 71 on a morning in early June of the fourth year. She rose at 4 the way she had risen every morning for what was now longer than she cared to count. She made her coffee, she pulled on the barn coat, which was still Thomas's, and which fit her better now than it had when she first began wearing it. She walked out onto the porch. The light was just beginning to come up over the water. She walked down the porch steps. She walked past the barn, where the aging yard stood quiet in the pre-dawn, and past the small office and past the equipment shed, where the new tractor sat, which the cooperative had bought her in the second year, over her polite objections. She walked out to the north field. She walked to the far end, past the stone wall Thomas's grandfather had laid to the very edge of the original half-acre, which the cooperative had preserved as a marker of where the work had started, and which grew that spring a heavy crop of tomatoes and squash under a low-wire trellis. She knelt down. Her knees protested the way they always had. She reached out. She lifted a handful of soil. It was dark. It was heavy with moisture that the ground had been dry enough to reject 4 years earlier. It crumbled easily against her thumb. Small, pale sections of shell caught the first horizontal light of the sun and glinted the way she remembered. Now the pile at the base of the loading ramp at Harrow's Point had glinted under the dock lights the first morning. She had stood at the end of that dock in her 2 large boots. 2 earthworms moved through the soil in her palm. She held them there a moment, and then gently she lowered her hand and let them return to the ground. She stayed on her knees another moment. She looked out across the field. Beyond it, a truck was coming up the farm road, the way trucks now came up the farm road every morning, hauling the day's shell from one of the 3 markets on the coast. The driver waved as he passed the field. She lifted her hand in return. She stood up slowly. She brushed the dust from her palms. People used to look at those piles of shells behind the market and see nothing but garbage, she said aloud to no one, to the field, to the man who was buried 2 miles down the road. They didn't understand that the ground was waiting for something to remember it. It just needed somebody patient enough to notice. She turned. She walked back toward the house through the light that was now coming up gold across the 18 acres, and behind her, the truck pulled into the aging yard, and the day began.